Hi, this is Andre Koen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us for another conversation. And in this conversation, we're going to talk about this idea of implicit versus unconscious bias, right? So a lot of times people try to use those interchangeably, but they actually do suggest different approaches to even addressing this notion of bias. But before we get into that, I want to invite you to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're really getting some great numbers. I'm really glad that this community is building, and it's happening organically, right? So it's not like we're going out and we're buying a bunch of lists or have a bunch of gimmicks. Actually, people are are gravitating towards our content, so we really appreciate that. And like or subscribe, or like and subscribe, but continue to work with us. Really excited about our growth and development. So when we start talking about this idea, first let's talk about this notion of bias. So what is bias? Um, well, bias is something that we all have. We all have bias. We have biases. We have bias, um, singular or plural. We have bias because we come from a context, right? And so our context limits our ability to know everything. We can't be, you know, we can't know everything because it's the nature of human beings to be limited in that way. And so when we have this notion of bias, we have to recognize that we all have it. We all carry it with us. And our responsibility is to make sure that we mitigate the impact of bias as we go about our daily lives making decisions, right? Because without that awareness of our biases, we could be making decisions that negatively impact our ability to reach our goals, right? So we want to make sure that we're aware of our bias, and we all have them. The thing that I want to address is a lot of times we'll hear people talk about this notion of unconscious bias, this bias that we don't know that we have, and we act out on those biases because we don't know that we're aware of them, right? And I think that's a valid way to kind of think about those biases. But this is a very individual kind of intervention, right? So this notion that if I, as an individual, master my biases, I will no longer act the opposite or in conflict with my values, with my intentions. My behaviors will be aligned in all of those ways. And that's a very individualistic approach to addressing our biases or our bias, right? This is very individual. So when people talk about unconscious bias, they were talking about individuals' unconscious bias, an individual's intervention in addressing bias. But one of the things that we have to recognize is that if I, as an individual, conquer my biases, that is a good step, right? However, there are many grains in the sand called bias, and so some of those grains of sand end up becoming implicit bias. And implicit bias is this notion that individual or unconscious bias then becomes systemic, right? So there are policies, there are procedures, there are laws in our organizations, in our communities, that are automatically biased just by the nature of that policy. And so an individual can work on their biases and reduce those. But until we talk about some of the baked in bias, we actually won't get the kind of traction we want to get as we seek to move forward and to become more effective. And so when we think about this notion of implicit bias, it really is, what is the bias that's baked into the system of our organizations? And so it becomes important for us to recognize those as we seek to be more effective. And so with that, I'm going to kind of stop this conversation. I'm going to say thank you so much for joining us in our discussion. Please like and subscribe if you appreciate the kinds of things that we're creating. We look forward to working with you and seeing who you become as we move forward. Again, my name is Andre Koen. This conversation was on implicit versus unconscious bias. And ultimately, it doesn't matter how you got the bias, you will be held accountable for what you do with it. My name is Andre Koen. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing who you become.